Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with my friend E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, and how are you, E.C.?
Wonderful. How are you?
Fantastic. We are going to talk about something somewhat controversial. We're going to talk about artificial and natural sweeteners. We're going to examine their safety, regulation, and effects on health. We're going to talk about the approval process in the U.S. and Europe, bust some common myths about sweetener safety, and specifically address concerns about gut health impacts. Excited to get into this. Before we do, I mentioned this in our last episode, but I was all by myself when I did it because it was just a quick intro to our coaching call. But I wanted to mention one more time, I came out with a kid's book. It's called The ABCs of Being Happy and Healthy, 26 little lessons for kids who want to grow up to be super wonderful. I wanted to put one more reminder out there for folks, maybe a nice little Christmas present for friends of yours who have kids.
Yeah, it's so beautiful.
Thank you.
I love it. So Patrick told me that he wrote this book, and I was like, oh my gosh, awesome. Have to get it. It's a relatively busy time of year. I mean, everybody's busy, but got some cool stuff coming out in the new year. So a little distracted, a lot of things going on. And
you were also traveling. You went out to Rogue.
I was also in Scotland. So I knew that we wanted to chat about the book a little bit, but I literally had this thought when I was ordering it of, oh my God, I do not have time to read this and review it by the time that we need to.
My favorite part is just the thought of reviewing it came to your mind. Like,
I think that, people have watched on Instagram or know, when I review these books, I try to do a lot of the reference deep dive and cross-reference and double back and take notes. And so when Patrick's like, I wrote this kid's book, I'm like, I don't have time, Patrick. It turns out I haven't read a kid's book in a while.
Yeah, it's 32 pages.
And I was able to get through it before dinner. It was fun. It was amazing. I got it. So I had the thought, I ordered it. And then when it came in the mail, I was like, oh, I got this. Yep. I could do this.
This one's right up your alley. All right. Well, thank you for reading it. Thank you for
awesome.
getting it. Again, it's called The ABCs of Being Happy and Healthy. You can get it on Amazon now. And I thank you in advance for doing so or for considering it. All right. Let's get to the heart of the matter here. Artificial and natural sweeteners. What the heck are we going to talk about? Why are we doing it?
Yeah, I guess it's been over 3 years now. I was like, oh gosh, we've talked about sweeteners. We did this. And I was like, oh, that was like spring of 21. So
we've been doing this for a while.
Yeah. Turns out the Consistency Project has been consistent for some time. Very consistent. But sweeteners is a hot topic, as you kind of already mentioned. And I asked on social media, hey, what questions do you have? And it turns out a lot of the questions we did answer. So we are going to go over a little bit of that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit more about natural sweeteners. That one's certainly skewed more towards artificial sweeteners, and then also gut health, as you mentioned, just because that is a very trendy topic these days. Okay,
cool. Let us get into what the heck are sweeteners and maybe what are the common artificial and natural sweeteners. When we see them, we should know that, oh, these are a sweetener. What are they?
Yeah, this is what makes, when people used to say sweeteners, there's so many ways to sweeten foods. So like, which ones are we talking about? And this can become such a huge topic because there's such a range here. But in the U.S., we have 6 artificial sweeteners that have been approved for use in food and drinks. And they are asulfame potassium, aspartame, neotame, saccharin, sucralose, and advantame. Now, there's really 3 that are the most popular. The most popular being sucralose, which is sold as Splenda. The next one is saccharin, which is sold as Sweet and Low. And the third most popular one, in the US anyway, is aspartame, which is sold as Equal. Now, I want to mention Europe. It comes up a lot in the news, especially more recently in the US with our current political climate. But Europe is often talked about as this place that they're just so much better than the US and they have so much more stringent regulations, especially around things like additives. I want you to know they allow for all of those artificial sweeteners as well. So if you're thinking that the US is totally backward from other countries on this, you're wrong. For natural sweeteners in the US, 3 have been approved. Stevia, which is definitely the one that most people are interested in. I guess it's Lohang Guao extract, but that's the same thing as monk fruit, which people will see on the back of labels. And then thaumatin, which I've actually never heard of, but it's a protein that's sweet and can be extracted from a fruit in West Africa. But those are the 3 that are approved in the US. Now, what I can find is that monk fruit is not approved in Europe, but the other two are. Now, that doesn't mean that monk fruit is dangerous. It just means that the European Food Safety Authority, is kind of our FDA equivalent, they've said about monk fruit that I can find online, they need more data to make a decision on it. I do want to also note that Europe permits 3 additional artificial sweeteners that the US does not. And I just don't think there's a lot of press around this. Like, why does Europe allow 3 more artificial sweeteners and we don't? You know, because I think a lot of the press that I see is Europe is doing everything right and the US isn't. And so where's the outrage over, oh my gosh, they have 3 additional artificial sweeteners in Europe? Now, from my point of view, you know, we have to remember things like the FDA, the EFSA, that's the European body. They're these really big organizations. They're not going to do everything the same way. They're not going to do everything in the same order. They don't have to agree on everything. And so I imagine that some of the reason why some things are approved and some things are not are just simply based on demand, you know, which different companies are petitioning them, how many products are in the market, that type of thing. So maybe in the US, there's a much greater push for monk fruit. Sort of seems like a great demand. More monk fruit, right? And there wasn't that same demand in Europe. You know, we can't look at disparities and automatically think that there's some wrongdoing. You know, it definitely is like, I would say better if we have agreement, at least gives us more peace of mind. But we shouldn't think that these disparities are automatically, oh my gosh, Europe is trying to hurt their population with 3 more artificial sweeteners, or the US is trying to hurt more people because of monk fruit. I think there's going to be some of those differences just by the weight of the fact that we're different countries. But I do think, especially under our current climate right now, that just pointing out that all of our artificial sweeteners and 2 of our 3 natural sweeteners are also approved in Europe should probably comfort some people. I do want to briefly mention, we're not going to spend much more time on it, but there is sort of a third group of sweeteners, which are sugar alcohols. These differ from artificial and natural sweeteners. One, because they're actually a little bit less sweet than sweeteners, and they have more calories than sweeteners. So sweeteners typically register at about 0 calories, especially in the doses that we use. Sugar alcohols will have a little bit more than that, but they will still have less calories than regular sugar. So this is why sugar alcohols may be used in place of regular sugar and can result in fewer calories overall. The most popular sugar alcohols are xylitol, erythritol, and maltitol. They are naturally occurring and they will be considered food additives when they're kind of used as a sweetener, and they are approved as additives in both the US and Europe again.
I want to get into the approval process in a second, but just for a little bit of context question, because I'm not sure I totally understand the distinction. Sweeteners versus sugars, those are different things, right? So when we're talking about sweeteners, we're not talking about agave, for example, or are we?
Well, in this context that I just described, artificial sweeteners and even the natural sweeteners, no. Okay. Because there's a certain chemical structure that would define a sugar, and the sweeteners don't have that same chemical structure. Got it. Now, you are right, though. Agave could be used to sweeten food, but you'd want to think about that much more similar to table sugar than a sweetener. Not because of what they do in the food, they both sweeten the food, but because of their chemical structure is different. Got it.
Okay. Talked about the various sweeteners that are, which ones are approved for use, US, Europe. What does that approval process look like? You hinted at it a little bit with the distinction, like maybe monk fruit is here because it's the, but
we need
what more
fruit.
do we need? I want to see a picket sign with more monk fruit. What do we need to know about that approval process?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are going to be reviewed independently. So it's not like, okay, if one sugar alcohol gets through, all of them get through. So you want to keep that in mind. All of them are going to kind of go through this process independently. And from what I understand, again, the European process is quite similar to the United States. So a big part of what they do is they often use animal studies to see how much can we feed an animal of this sweetener before any negative health effects occur. And so they'll keep actually dosing the animal up until something negative happens. And then they figure out, okay, what was the dose right before something negative happened? And that dose right before something negative happened is called the no effects level, essentially. No effects occurred at that level. And they take that level and they effectively reduce it by a factor of 100 as a protective measure for humans, saying, okay, we want to make sure that whatever we're saying is okay for humans is much, much, much reduced from what we're seeing is okay in animals. So let's say the no effects level in animals in an animal study was like 100 milligrams per kilogram body weight. They would say the upper limit for human consumption is then 1 milligram per kilogram body weight. And that limit is then what they call the acceptable daily intake, or the ADI. Now, what they also do is they confirm that that ADI level will not be hit by a relatively high intake of typical products. So they look at like, okay, what would be the level that's in a Diet Coke can? How many Diet Coke could somebody drink in a day before they'd hit this ADI level? And so the sweetener in Diet Coke is aspartame. The ADI in the US is 50 milligrams of aspartame per kilogram body weight every day. And you could consume that every day and not expect any negative health effects. So a 150-pound person could have over 3,400 milligrams of aspartame per day, which translates into 17 cans of Diet Coke, which is just over 6 liters. And they could expect no negative health effects from that if they were to consume that every day. That's an insane amount of Diet Coke. And so when people often ask me these sweetener questions, they often will caveat, it's like, I drink a lot. And I'm thinking to myself, it's still not that.
Yeah.
It's just still not that, right? Now, what's interesting here is I do want to point out that the ADI for aspartame in Europe is lower. It's 40 milligrams per kilogram instead of 50. Mm-hmm. So that same 150-pound person would get a little bit more than 13 cans of Diet Coke, or close to 5 liters.
Sure.
So this is an example where you could say, okay, Europe is more strict, right? They have a lower level that's allowed, but we're still talking about an insane amount of Diet Coke that no one is drinking. And if someone is drinking that much, I'd say reduce it, because I'm not sure with 13 and a half cans of Diet Coke, how are you fitting in any other, like, how do you have enough volume in your stomach, let alone the time, because you're in the restroom peeing, you know? Like, there's just some logistical issues about this that really start to be the problem, maybe not even the aspartame. Now, just to quickly touch on the other two artificial sweeteners to really help set the context here, you need about 51 packets of Sweet and Low, that's the saccharin, to reach the US daily limit. And in Europe, it would be about 28 packets. So again, you could say, okay, well, Europe is so much more strict than the US. But again, who in the US is even getting to 28 packets of saccharin a day? I mean, there's a problem there. Now, the situation is reversed once we look at sucralose. Europe actually allows 3 times more sucralose than what the USDA allows, and the USDA limit would put somebody about 26 packets per day. Of course, I'm giving these all in these 150-pound person limits. Now, some people might start to get confused. Well, why is there such a big disparity between the US and Europe in terms of how much is allowed? I think it's just going to come down to, hey, what studies did they get sent to them from the companies that are using these? What data do they consider better than other studies? And so there's going to be their expert opinions on how to come up with these numbers and the limits. But in either case, if we just kind of take a step back and look at real life scenarios, whether or not we're arguing about 28 packets a day or 51 packets a day, we're sort of in the realm of like, okay, this is no longer applicable. And if it is applicable, I'm willing to bet that person has way bigger fish to fry than necessarily the aspartame. Like, there's other things in their life that probably need to be addressed.
To your point, if they're drinking that much Diet Coke, they're probably not eating any fish, whether it's fried or not.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So that was artificial. Is there any difference for the approval process for natural sweeteners?
Yeah, and I definitely want to kind of just stay focused on stevia, not the whole monk fruit.
Can we do a whole episode on monk fruit? Because I think I know what it is.
Let's sign us up for a whole monk fruit episode. Okay, yeah. Stevia is definitely the most common natural sweetener. It's actually a plant native to South America. And we use stevia, though, to also refer to the extracts that we get from the plant, from its leaves, really. There's 11 different of these sweet-tasting compounds called steviol glycosides in the leaves. And when we extract those compounds and the extracts have at least 95% of their composition are these steviol glycosides, that's when it's allowed to be used as a sweetener. And I go through all of that because this also helps set the regulation. We're not allowed to use some like really crude levels of extract. We have to make sure that they're, quote unquote, pure, if you will. Now, in the US, stevia doesn't go through the same approval process as artificial sweeteners, which may make you nervous until you kind of come to a similar conclusion that we just went through. It might not matter. So in the US, stevia is allowed to be in the food, and it was allowed to be that way because it's submitted through what's known as a GRAS determination, where GRAS is an acronym for generally recognized as safe. So for this GRAS determination, companies can petition the FDA and say, hey, we've already got these qualified experts. They know the chemical structure. They know that this thing is safe. We don't need as many tests. We don't need as much clinical evidence. We don't need to go through this whole estimation process. Hey, this thing is safe. Now, when you hear something like that, I understand that there could be fear that that process is definitely kind of ripe for corruption or bias or bureaucracy. Okay, let's say that it is. Let's take a look at Europe. Europe set the limit of stevia at 4 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day, which results in this limit of about 40 stevia packets a day for a 150-pound person.
That's a day.
So again, you could sort of be like, okay, Europe is better because they're more strict, they have more regulation. But the practical application of this is maybe they just have more regulation around something that's not even happening. You know, like who is using 40 stevia packets a day? For all intents and purposes, it's sort of limitless in the sense of nobody's going to get to that type of level. Mm-hmm. Now, this is just a funny little offside story. I actually wrote to Zevia, which is the U.S. company that uses stevia for their drinks, because I wanted to know, like, hey, how much stevia is in a can so that I could kind of figure out how many cans of Zevia can you drink a day. Now, they wouldn't tell me because it's, proprietary blend.
Yeah.
But I found an article related to, like, hey, what would this really play out to kind of stevia-flavored beverages? Because these things are so sweet, you just can't put that much of a sweetener in these cans of Coke. And basically the estimation, it wasn't for Zevia, it was just kind of very broad, was saying, hey, you'd probably have to drink about 3.5 liters of this stuff for a 150-pound person to get anywhere near the stevia limits in Europe. And, even if somebody comes to me and they're like, I drink a lot of Zevia, it's like, okay, what is that, 5-6 cans? I mean, that's a lot, but that's still way less than what this upper limit would be, So not the same approval process, but I think the end result is the doses that anybody's doing, even if they're considering it's a high level of consumption, it's still going to be well below what's accepted as safe either here or in Europe.
What is the scientific research, backing up a little bit before we even get to public policy, what does the scientific research look like around the safety of sweeteners in general?
Yeah, and we definitely did touch on some of these issues with the artificial one we did before, and we actually also had a follow-up Q&A there. So I really encourage people who want more of the science to check out those links we'll put in the show notes. One of the things I'd also like to remind people about, okay, we want to go to the scientific literature, and I think that's great. It's another party that can validate or check what our government policy is doing, and I think that's wonderful. We want another way to make sure that what we're doing is safe. The problem in quotes, with the scientific literature in sweeteners, it's really true of most things in nutrition, is that there's no way that we can run a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial where we give some people sweeteners, others not. We follow them for 20, 30 years and then see what happens to them in terms of cancer, heart disease, all of that stuff. Now, that would be the strongest evidence for us to be like, okay, this is safe, and this is totally safe at these doses, but it's totally unrealistic as well. So if that's the type of evidence that you want to feel safe about sweeteners, then sweeteners are not for you. You can be healthy without them, right? Okay, but what can we do and what evidence do we have? Well, besides looking at how does the body handle these compounds, and guess what? It changes based on the compound. Some are just excreted, some are metabolized. We look at also the animal toxicity studies to set the limits. We look at, hey, how much are going to be in food that people are exposed to, all of that stuff. In addition to that, we can look at association studies. We ask people whether they consume them or not, how much they consume, and then we see, okay, the people that consume a lot, are they more likely to have X more diseases at a certain rate, or do they die at a faster rate? So again, kind of with this update episode, there's this Chen 2024 paper in the show notes. They found no significant association between artificial sugar intake and cancer mortality. That's something that we reported before. Now, they did find a significant association with artificial sweeteners and heart disease mortality, which, again, cancer and heart disease are our two top killers, which is why I tend to highlight these. Again, so they did find a significant association between artificial sweeteners and heart disease mortality when they were comparing people who had a high intake versus a low intake. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't actually figure out in the paper what exactly the high versus the low intake was. Are we talking 40 packets of stevia or what? But nevertheless, there is a little bit of risk increase. But the problem with, just running with this study and then saying everybody needs to avoid sweeteners is that this association study that we've talked about before. It does not necessarily prove that the sweeteners are causing the heart disease. Now, on the flip side of that, that doesn't mean we write off that finding. But what it does mean is, hey, we have to consider why this finding may be happening and what could be the other reasons for it. Perhaps people who have heart disease switch to sweeteners. One of the things that elevates our risk for heart disease is excess weight. And so maybe people, in an attempt to lose weight to lower their heart disease risk or risk factors, they then go from drinking soda to drinking something with sweeteners. And so really, maybe it's people who are using sweeteners at a higher intake are more reflective of people who are trying to lose weight. And it's the weight that's increasing their cardiovascular disease risk and mortality, not necessarily the sweetener. So this is where we can start to lose, like, hey, what's driving what? And that's a very plausible scenario here. This is also why there's been studies that have found that there's a higher association between sweeteners and obesity. Are the sweeteners driving the obesity? No, because in controlled trials, we see that they help with weight loss. But it's more likely that people who are looking to lose weight are going to be using foods with sweeteners, right? And so association studies are good at identifying where there might be a problem that we need to look more into, but they certainly don't confirm the reason for that problem or the explanation of that problem. So my interpretation of this study, even though we see this slightly elevated risk with artificial sweeteners and heart disease, is I don't think they're particularly risky, assuming the person has a mostly whole and processed foods diet. We've heard that one before, maintains a healthy weight, exercises, and on and on. But I do like to acknowledge that there are some findings like that. It's not like there's nothing out there that could be used as in a negative way. I also just want to touch on the fact that people really worry about sweeteners and things like, does it increase my insulin and does it make me more hungry? We really don't see that play out in the research. Definitely check out the earlier podcasts on that. If anything, what we find, especially in the long term, is that sweeteners can help people lose weight, which tends to then lower their insulin and tends to also mean that they're not necessarily hungry. So these fears tend to be unfounded. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then quickly switching to stevia, no surprise, the overwhelming evidence out there suggests that stevia use is safe. There's more than 200 studies demonstrating its safety. This is why it's been, approved for use in multiple countries. And just like sweeteners, we think that there might be, if anything, a positive effect of using stevia because it replaces sugar and therefore lowers calories and potentially helps the person lose weight. And so there's a Kim paper in the show notes of how stevia use could reduce cardiovascular disease risk. And not only that, but there's it's the itritis paper in the show notes, that some of the stevia molecules, when stevia is metabolized, could actually be anti-cancer. So not just like net neutral, no association, but there might be protective effect. Now, let's not run to the bank on that. I don't want people switching over to massive stevia diets and avoiding the fruits and veggies. But right now, our evidence is suggesting that there is no enhanced risk from using stevia.
Okay, before we wrap, we wanted to hit on gut health a little bit. What do we need to know about sweeteners and gut health?
Gut health. That is the topic that everybody wants to know about. When we talk about gut health, we're talking about these microorganisms, thousands of them that live in your GI tract, most of them in your colon. And people worry about how this composition is changing. And the main point I want people to remember is just because the gut microbiota, the gut microbe species change, this doesn't mean it changes your health risk. So you might hear a headline that's like, sweeteners alter your gut microbiome. And I want you to think, so what? Like, okay, maybe it alters it in a neutral way. Maybe it even alters it in a positive way. The assumption I think people have is when they hear alters is that alters always means negative, that all change is bad, and that's not necessarily true. Maybe the change in my gut health doesn't result in any more death or disease. Then do I care? No, I don't, right? Now, there have been some studies that have suggested some change in the gut microbiome species, specifically with saccharin and sucralose, artificial sweeteners. But being able to link that to more death or disease hasn't really been there. That's a harder case to prove. Now, in terms of stevia, there actually was a really recent paper from this year by Singh in the show notes. I think it's one of the only kind of randomized controlled trials with stevia and gut health to date. They looked at normal doses of stevia. They gave people stevia at those doses for about 12 weeks, and they looked at gut health. And basically they found, quote, large-scale changes in the gut microbiota were not apparent in this study, and therefore our data suggests that stevia does not significantly impact the gut microbiota, end quote. So far, we don't really see that stevia has a problem on gut health either.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways for you, for us, as it relates to sweeteners? What should we walk away with?
Two things. If somebody's having a lot of sweeteners, I see two potential problems. The first one we've already kind of joked around about, like you don't have a lot of whole foods in your diet. I mean, 17 cans of Diet Coke means you aren't eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. In my opinion, the problem with a diet that's high in sweeteners is that you have probably a lack of fruits and veggies. I think the problem is more the lack of fruits and veggies than necessarily the aspartame or whatever the artificial sweetener is. So fruits, veggies, whole food proteins, those don't contain sweeteners. Those are the foods that promote health. So if sweetener foods, sweetener drinks are pushing out those foods in your diet, we have a problem. I do think there is, not necessarily with appetite or insulin spiking, but I think there might be kind of a problem with sweeteners that, again, if you like a lot of sweeteners, it might indicate the palate that you like. If you like 6 stevia in your coffee in the morning, you probably don't really like the taste of like a plain potato or salmon or broccoli. And so you might be finding doing a more whole foods diet or sticking within your caloric target a little bit harder simply because your palate skews to what would be a really sweet processed diet. And so in cases like that, if you really haven't developed the palate for whole foods and you have a good amount of sweeteners in your diet, weaning back on that, I think, can actually be a great strategy such that we can start to really enjoy the whole foods in the diet and actually have them become more of a representative part of our diet such that the sweeteners kind of take a back seat. Again, I don't think it's the sweeteners per se that's the problem. I think it's what it's doing to our consumption of whole foods that could be a problem.
Super interesting. All right. Thank you, EC. Thanks, everybody out there, for listening to the show. Thank you for subscribing wherever you are listening or watching this. We appreciate it. EC and I will be back next week for a new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.